Hey guys, today I wanted to do a quick talk on what makes a deck good. I get so many discussions. Is this deck good? Is this the best deck? So many questions. And the problem is it's a very loaded question because the reality is we don't have a stable definition of what makes a deck good. What is good? Is it the highest win rate deck? Is it the deck that the most people play? Is it the deck that the most people get number one legend with? People have very different definitions. If you're, is it the player that the most amount of people can do well with? Is it a deck that the absolute top tier of players do well with? Is it what makes a deck good? We don't have a good definition, so it can mean a lot of different things. I want to talk about just some different definitions of good and what it means for you. Because I think this constant search for the best deck and for the perfect deck with that is just the strongest is actually hurting you more than it's helping you. I think a lot of people are constantly looking for the perfect deck. I used to joke around that it's like, when people are constantly looking for the perfect relationship, and then they get in the relationship and they realize, oh, this isn't the magical thing. I have to work at this. Same thing with decks. If you have a deck, it's not just going to necessarily come easy. You have to improve. You have to work on it. So anyways, so I want to talk about some positive attributes of decks, things that I think are what do make a deck. One is high win rate. Isn't good. It is definitely good. And high win rate can mean different things. It can mean different win rates of different skills. Certain decks will be good at Diamond. Certain decks will be good at Legend. Certain decks will be good at High Legend. Certain decks, people think that they're bad at good at High Legend because they're high skill, but it's really because there's a different meta. The different deck. There's a lot of different decks played at High Legend that there's played at Diamond through 5. So high win rate can also not be necessarily black and white. There's not necessarily a clear this is always the highest win rate deck. So that's why I like having a high meta resiliency. That's a deck's resistance to being targeted. So a deck that's really high meta resilient right now is Quest Warlock. It's one of the strongest decks, and it's very hard to target. There are a few ways you can target it, but usually it comes at a cost. The deck is very, very well rounded. It's very, very strong. A deck that has very low meta resiliency is Poison Rogue. Now, Poison Rogue has a good win rate overall on ladder because of all the Quest Warlocks and the Quest Mages. But realistically, if I play aggro or I run oozes, the deck gets annihilated. It's so easy to counter. So if Poison Rogue ever becomes a top deck and everybody's playing it, people run oozes, bam, the deck is terrible. Happens all the time. So Poison Rogue, while it might be a strong deck in the current meta, that is a deck that sort of takes a attribute that takes away from it being a good deck, in my opinion. Next thing, we have enjoyable gameplay. Is the deck fun? Is it a deck that is enjoyable to play? And then kind of like replayability is, does it get old fast or does it get better with time? Certain decks are fun the first time or fun for a while, and then they get boring. Other decks, they're actually not fun to play at first, but after you play them a lot, they become really fun. I think that's something to celebrate. If you're saying, oh, should I play this deck? Should I start to get good at this deck that has very little replayability or this deck that has massive replayability? I'd say go with the massive replayability. Maybe it has a lower win rate, but over time, you might actually get a higher win rate because you enjoy it more and you play it more. And then we have strength against specific decks. This is very common with tournaments where you'll play decks that aren't good on ladder, but because there's a common deck that happens in the tournament, and because you could ban, they will have a deck that's actually very strong in a tournament lineup that isn't strong on ladder. So that's another element that I think is a real positive attribute. So there's a lot of decks that might not be top tier ladder decks, but they can be really, really good tournament decks. And I got some next. I wanted some personal reasons for a deck to be good. One, it's affordable. And the converse can also be true. But a deck that doesn't have a lot of legendaries can be really good for a lot of players. You might have am I going to go invest $200 worth of dust to buy a deck that has a 0.5% win rate more when I could play this deck that's way cheaper? I think a much better use of your time if you are on a budget. There's no need often to invest all this money just to get a slight higher win rate. Is it memeable? Is there are these moments where you're like, oh, this is crazy? Does it fit into your playstyle? I personally like decks that really use board. I think that's one of the things I really enjoy. A lot of people like these heavy combo decks. A lot of decks like these very strong, these control decks. Does the deck go into your playstyle? Do you have experience with this deck? So this deck could be good for you just because you're well experienced in the style. Does it have a lot of RNG or does it not have a lot of RNG? Some players, there's a meme on Reddit called the Hearthstone Political Compass, where they had a bunch of players, myself included, what kind of this. And certain players like a lot of RNG. Certain players don't like a lot of RNG. Certain players like a lot of created by. Certain players don't. And is it beginner or expert friendly? For some players, a really hard deck would be a disaster for them to play. And for other players, playing a beginner deck that they might be able to get a good win rate with. If you're playing Face Hunter or Secret Paladin, you might be able to get a good win rate. You might be able to get top 25 Legend with as a good player, but you might just be bored out of your mind. And you also might often. What's interesting, if decks are not hard enough, you will disengage, you will autopilot, and you will actually play them worse because it is too easy of a deck for you. Now, you can sometimes focus and try and find those decisions. That's a good habit, but sometimes it's just easier to say, I'm going to take a deck that's naturally engaging because the decisions are very complex and difficult. So I think there's a case for playing decks that are hard or at your skill level just to engage your brain, and that will actually both make you a better player long-term, but also engage you better. So I just want to emphasize, Hearthstone is a highly skilled game, and I think people think that it's all RNG and it's all luck. And when I play against players that I'm significantly better, my win rate is insane. If I'm climbing on another server with a deck I'm good at, so I'm at a low rank, my win rate is insane. It's only because I'm playing against other top players who are also like world-class players who have mastered their decks, and they're playing decks that I've played. My win rate won't be as nearly as high. But the reality is, I could have a deck with a win rate much lower than yours. That's maybe just an objectively worse deck, but I can outplay you, and that's what you want to be doing. I think people think they just want to play the best mathematical strategies, but that's not necessarily the best for you. There's kind of interesting cases in other games. So, for example, Magnus Carlsen, a chess player, will often do openings that are very non-standard, and they mathematically might have be worse openers, but they're better for him. Why? Because they put his opponents in situations that they're not familiar with, and situations where they're likely to make mistakes, and situations where he can outplay them. That matters. So it's a thing of, if you play a deck that has a lower win rate, but you're outplaying your opponent, you're putting them in mistakes, that's something you can do to benefit. There's spots like this in poker, in backgammon. I know there's in poker, if you're in a heads-up scenario with a player that's far worse than you, and at the end of a tournament, often you will flat call on the button every single hand, even though that's far from mathematically optimal. Why? Because you want to keep the pot small, and you want to outplay your opponent, and you want to reduce variance. Hearthstone has a lot of that similar concept of you might be playing a deck that is not as good of a deck overall, but it's in your skill set and your strengths. So, and even I kind of want to take a quick look. Here we've got decks. We've got the meta. If you look at the meta, you can see Aggro Shadow Priest is one of the top performers in the meta right now. It's doing very good. You got Aggro Druid. But I want you to think about, the highest win rate deck 54%. So you think, okay, that's a really good deck. Well, the reality is, so I don't know if you guys remember the old Legend system, and if you don't have a star bonus, the old Legend system, you started at 5 stars, and you had to get 5 wins to move up, and you had to get 25 of each, and then if you did that, and you went up 25 wins, you would go to Legend. Now, if you have the star bonus, it's a lot easier now, but if you don't have the 2-star bonus, you might have to net 25 games. Now, with the old system, so it's a lot less black and white. If you get the net 25 games at 54% win rate, it would take you about 600 games to get to Legend. That's a lot of games with the best deck in the game. The reality is we don't want to have a 54% win rate. We want to have a better win rate. If you're a better player, you've put in your time in your game, you've worked on it, and you're trying to get to Legend, your win rate should be significantly higher than 54%. And if you spend if realistically you have good Hearthstone fundamentals, I recommend watching my tempo fundamentals list. But if you play your fundamentals well, but you're not perfect, so many players are not playing the fundamentals well that you will have a significantly better than 54% win rate, and you will get to Legend. So it's the climbing at the 54% win rate will take and this is one of the best decks in the game right now, will take a long time. Realistically, like I said, you want to be aiming for higher than that. You want to be outplaying your opponents, and because of that, your win rate will be higher. What does this mean when we see a deck has this much win rate? That means across all skill levels at Legend, at least for this stat, all skill levels, all players, this is the win rate. But there are some players who play this deck who have a 45% win rate. There's some players who play this who have a 60% win rate. There's some players who have a 70% win rate. There also could be situations where a player has a 71% win rate, their rank goes up, and then their win rate goes down. So there are a lot of confounding variables with that, but the bottom line is this is an average, and you can beat the average, and you should expect to beat the average if you're above the skill level of your of the opponents you're playing. And so that's what we want to go for. We have a higher win rate until we get so many wins that the MMR system puts you with a player who is at a similar skill level as you, and you can do that. And then you were likely to have around a 50% win rate. But bottom line is, just because a deck has a 54% win rate, or 50 or 49, even in the long run, that might not be your win rate. There's all these other variables. One of the fundamental assumptions of statistics that players will make is that the win rate of all these players applies to you. And that's a good assumption, but there's sometimes it's not a true assumption. You might be very, very skilled at this deck. You might be very unskilled at this deck relative to the other strike. You might climb to top 1,000 Legend with a very combo deck, and then you have to play a board deck, and you're not as good at those. So there's kind of an assumptions that go into that when statisticians make these judgments, but they're not always true. So bottom line, still it's very useful, but at the end of the day, you should be trying to find a deck that works for you. And just because the deck has a high win rate, just because other players say it's good, doesn't mean it's good. So, bottom line, I just want to say in conclusion, what does this mean for you? Pick a deck you like. Pick a deck. One of the big things I'd say is if you're playing a deck and you're making mistakes and you're seeing those mistakes, that's a really good sign. If you're naturally saying, oh, I did this, I could do this next game, I could do this game. If you're playing a deck and you have no idea what you're doing wrong every single game. Now, sometimes you're playing a deck and you just got to get the familiarity with it. You're so confused. But if you're playing a deck and every game it feels like I don't know what I should do to improve, that might not be a deck that naturally plays into your learning style. So it's really good to get that immediate feedback. So if you're playing a deck, you're like, oh, I needed to coin out that Soul Rend to kill this board, because if I didn't, they just did too much damage. Or I needed to go for the lethal this turn because they OTK'd me next turn. Stuff like that. So if you can make those adjustments with your deck, but if you can't, if you have no idea what you're doing realistically, that's going to be very hard to. So that's one of the big things I recommend. For other another thing is I recommend a tempo-based style stuff. Ideal where you're playing minions or you're putting stuff in play and you're going for the win. Very kind of attrition control-y based, which is not actually that prevalent in the meta. I don't recommend. Combo can be okay too, but even combo, if it's kind of still playing and stuff. But I also think for beginner players, playing a deck with a simple win condition is good. So I've been playing a lot of Garrote Rogue lately. That is not a recommend because there's so many different win conditions. You could win with tempo, you could win with OTK, you could win sometimes by playing control. You need to be well knowing of what your win condition is for every single matchup, and they can switch throughout the game. Where if you're playing Secret Paladin, it's usually play stuff, put minions on board, go for the kill. And that's what I recommend for beginner players. Play a deck that 1 is tempo based, 2 with a simple win condition, and 3 that you feel naturally you find mistakes that you make. So like I said, just because a deck has a high win rate, just because somebody says this is the best deck of the game, doesn't mean it's the best for you. And the reality is, what is best, what is good, you can talk to the philosophers. I gave a bunch of ideas that's good, but good can mean different things for different people. So bottom line is pick a deck that's good for you, try out different decks, but I say those 3 things. Deck that you naturally find mistakes, that's tempo based, and has a clear win condition, I think are really good for players who are unsure of what deck to play. So anyways, hope you guys like that, and happy climbing.